2,600 years ago, in a small city on the western edge of what we now call Turkey, a man looked up at the stars and asked a question so simple and so radical that the entire history of Western philosophy flows directly from it. Anaximander of Miletus was not a priest, not a prophet, and not a king. He was something the world had never quite seen before, a human being who decided to explain the universe using only his own mind. He left behind just one surviving sentence of his writing, and yet that single sentence has been studied and argued over by philosophers for more than 2 millennia. This is the story of the man who may have invented the very idea of rational inquiry into nature, and whose vision of reality was so far ahead of its time that even today it continues to startle us.
Miletus, in the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, was one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. A prosperous Ionian Greek city sitting at the mouth of the Meander River on the Aegean coast, surrounded by the cultures of Lydia to the east and Persia further beyond, while maintaining trade connections with Egypt, Babylon, and the distant corners of the ancient world. This was not a city of quiet provincial contentment, but a restless, commercially vigorous, intellectually hungry place where merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and scholars jostled together in the marketplace, and where ideas traveled alongside goods across the sea lanes and caravan routes that linked the ancient world. Anaximander was born into this environment around the year 610 before the Common Era, the product of a civilization that was simultaneously practical and curious, that needed to navigate by the stars and to understand what the stars actually were. The confluence of all these influences created exactly the kind of mind that could look at the existing explanations of the world and find them not just inadequate, but philosophically dishonest. The immediate intellectual environment that shaped Anaximander was centered on a man we know as Thales, who was either his teacher, his mentor, or simply his older contemporary, depending on which ancient source you consult, but who was certainly the figure against whom Anaximander defined himself, and whom he both admired and transcended. Thales was already legendary in the ancient world for his practical achievements, his prediction of a solar eclipse, his geometric theorems, his engineering advice to the Lydian king Croesus, and his proposed solution to the question of what the fundamental stuff of the universe is, which was water. He had looked at the world and observed that water seemed to be everywhere, that moisture was essential to life, that the earth seemed to float on a vast subterranean sea, and he had drawn the conclusion that water was the underlying substance from which everything else was made. This was a genuinely revolutionary step because it replaced mythological explanations with a material one, but Anaximander saw immediately that it did not go far enough. The young man who would become Thales' most brilliant successor grew up in a world where Greek religion explained the movements of the sky, the violence of storms, the fertility of the earth, and the behavior of human societies through the actions of personal divine beings who had histories, desires, quarrels, and favorites. Zeus hurled thunderbolts out of anger or to make a point. Poseidon stirred the seas according to his moods. The changing of the seasons reflected the grief of Demeter for her abducted daughter. These explanations were vivid and emotionally satisfying. They gave the world a human face and made it feel responsive to human needs and human prayers. But they explained nothing in any systematic sense, because a divine will can always do anything at any time, and the only way to predict its behavior is to know the God personally, which no human being actually does. Anaximander looked at this explanatory framework and found it not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong in its approach.
He was, by all accounts, a man of substantial personal authority and social standing, someone whose opinions were taken seriously not just in philosophical circles, but in the practical affairs of his community. Ancient sources record that he led or advised a colonial expedition from Miletus to Apollonia on the Black Sea coast, which tells us he was trusted with real responsibility by his fellow citizens, and that his philosophical interests did not cut him off from the concerns of the world around him.
He was also, apparently, the first Greek thinker to write his ideas down in prose rather than in verse, which was itself a philosophical choice, a decision to separate the pursuit of truth from the authority of poetic tradition and to present ideas in a form that invited rational evaluation rather than aesthetic appreciation. This decision to write prose was not just a stylistic preference, it was a statement that the truth about nature was a matter for argument and evidence, not for inspired recitation. The world Anaximander inhabited was one in which maps were either non-existent or crude and unreliable, in which the shapes of continents and the extent of the seas were matters of genuine uncertainty, in which educated people understood that the earth they walked on was somehow embedded in a larger cosmos, but had wildly varying and mostly wrong ideas about how that embedding actually worked. And yet this was also a world in which Greek merchant sailors had been ranging across the Mediterranean for generations, trading with Egypt and Carthage and the cities of the Black Sea, accumulating practical geographic knowledge that was not yet organized into any coherent picture. Anaximander stepped into this situation and did something that had never been done before in the Greek world. He drew a map of the entire known world, placing the Earth's surface on a flat disk with Greece near the center and the ocean surrounding everything on all sides. The map itself has not survived, but ancient descriptions of it tell us enough to understand its significance. It was not just a practical navigator's chart, but a philosophical statement, a claim that the world has a spatial structure that human reason can grasp and represent, that the apparent chaos of different lands and seas and peoples resolves into a coherent whole when seen from a sufficiently elevated perspective. The act of making the map already embodied the central conviction of Anaximander's philosophy that the universe is an ordered system, that order is accessible to the rational mind, and that the job of the philosopher is to make that order visible. This conviction drove everything else he did, from his account of the fundamental stuff of reality to his theory of how life first arose, and it was so powerful and so fruitful that it effectively founded the Western scientific and philosophical tradition.
His life seems to have been long by ancient standards, with most sources placing his death sometime after 547 before the Common Era, which would give him more than 60 years and perhaps significantly more. We have no dramatic stories of his death, no final words, no moment of triumphant recognition by contemporaries who finally understood what he had been saying all along. What we have is the work, and the work, fragmentary and filtered through later summaries as it is, remains one of the most astonishing intellectual achievements of the ancient world. He appears to have been respected in his own time, read and discussed by subsequent generations of Ionian philosophers, and remembered as a major figure by Aristotle and the tradition of philosophical historians who came after him. But understanding why he deserves to be remembered requires going beyond biography and entering the territory of his actual ideas. Anaximander wrote a book, his only book as far as we know, a prose treatise on nature that ancient sources refer to as periphyseos, meaning concerning nature, which was also the title used for the works of several of his philosophical successors. The book covered cosmology, the origin and structure of the universe, meteorology, the explanation of weather phenomena, and what we might call evolutionary biology, the origin and development of living things, including human beings. It was comprehensive in its ambition and systematic in its approach, attempting to give a coherent account of everything from the fundamental nature of reality to the specific mechanics of thunder and lightning and the precise way in which the first living creatures emerged from primordial moisture. Most of it is lost, surviving only in quotations and paraphrases by later writers, most of whom were working centuries after Anaximander himself. The ancient sources who discuss Anaximander include some of the most important figures in the philosophical tradition. Aristotle discusses him at length in his Physics and Metaphysics, treating him as a serious philosophical predecessor whose ideas deserve careful critical engagement. Theophrastus,
Aristotle's successor and the man responsible for the systematic history of earlier philosophy that underlies most of what we know about pre-Socratic thought, wrote extensively about Anaximander. Simplicius, the 6th century commentator on Aristotle, preserved the single surviving verbatim fragment of Anaximander's writing in his commentary on the Physics, which is why we have it at all. These later sources are invaluable, but also inevitably interpretive, reading Anaximander through the concerns and categories of their very different philosophical contexts.
What comes through clearly, despite all the filtering and paraphrasing, is a mind of extraordinary originality and boldness, someone who was not content with tinkering with inherited explanations, but who felt the need to go all the way back to the most fundamental questions and rebuild understanding from the ground up. Where Thales had replaced mythological explanations with a material one and stopped there, Anaximander went further and asked a harder question. Not just what is everything made of, but why is that particular thing the fundamental stuff rather than something else? This question, which seems almost impossibly abstract, turns out to be the crucial move that takes philosophy from clever observation to genuine systematic thought. And the answer Anaximander gave to it remains one of the most philosophically productive ideas in the entire history of human thinking. He was also, it is worth noting, someone who seems to have approached his philosophical work with a kind of moral seriousness that was more than merely intellectual. The single surviving sentence of his writing, which we will examine in detail in a later section of this video, uses the language of justice and injustice, of penalty and retribution to describe what happens when elements in the natural world become too dominant and are eventually corrected. This is not a casual metaphor borrowed from the law courts to make an abstract point vivid. It reflects a deep conviction that the natural order and the moral order are not separate domains, but expressions of the same underlying structure of reality. That what makes the cosmos a cosmos rather than chaos is precisely the same kind of balance and proportion that makes a community rather than a war of all against all. Understanding Anaximander fully requires holding together two things that might at first seem unrelated: the rigorous logical drive to find the most fundamental explanation for everything that exists, and the moral intuition that the universe is not neutral, but is, in some deep sense, ordered toward justice, toward the prevention of permanent domination by any single element or force. These two dimensions of his thinking are not in tension. They are two aspects of the same basic orientation toward the world: the conviction that behind the apparent chaos and conflict of everyday experience, there is an underlying order that is both intelligible and, in some sense, good. Not good in the sense of friendly to human wishes, but good in the sense of holding together, of preventing any single force from consuming everything else and collapsing reality into a single undifferentiated thing. To understand how these two convictions worked together in Anaximander's thought, we need to turn to the most important and most audacious idea he ever had.
The question Anaximander was answering when he proposed his most famous concept was the question his teacher, Thales, had answered before him. But Anaximander found Thales's answer insufficient, and he had a precise philosophical reason for finding it insufficient. If water is the fundamental stuff of everything, then water is unlimited. It pervades all reality, it underlies everything else. But water also has an opposite: fire. And fire and water are in perpetual conflict with each other, each trying to consume and eliminate the other. If water is fundamental, what prevents the fire from drying out all the water, or the water from quenching all the fire? More deeply, if water is the fundamental stuff, why does fire exist at all? Why does anything exist that is not water? The logic of making one familiar, determinate thing the fundamental substance seems to immediately generate this kind of incoherence, because every determinate thing in the world has properties that conflict with the properties of other things, and making one of those conflicting things the ultimate ground of everything else leaves the conflict unexplained. Anaximander's solution to this problem was so bold and so philosophically strange that even today it retains something of its power to startle a reader who encounters it for the first time. He proposed that the ultimate stuff of reality, the arche, the Greek word for beginning or principle that later philosophers used to name what Anaximander was pointing at, is not any familiar determinate substance at all. It is not water, not fire, not air, not earth. It is something he called the APEIRON, a Greek word that means the boundless, the unlimited, the indefinite. The APEIRON is not just very large or very old or very powerful. It is without limits of any kind, without boundaries, without determinate qualities, without beginning or end in time, and without the kind of specific character that would allow you to say it is this kind of thing rather than that kind of thing. This is an extraordinarily abstract proposal for someone working around 600 before the Common Era, a time when abstract thought was barely beginning to develop the conceptual tools it would need over subsequent centuries. To propose that the ultimate substance of reality is not any observable or imagined thing, but is specifically the negation of all determinacy, specifically the refusal to be any particular thing, is to make a move that requires holding an idea in mind that cannot be visualized, cannot be pointed to, cannot be experienced directly, but can only be grasped through a kind of negative reasoning that strips away all the familiar features of things until nothing specific remains. The APEIRON is not a cloud or an ocean or a void. It is the condition of possibility for all clouds and oceans and voids, the reservoir from which all determinate things emerge without itself being any one of them.
Why did Anaximander think this was philosophically necessary rather than just philosophically interesting? The core of his argument, reconstructed from later summaries because he does not give us a direct account of his reasoning, seems to be that if anything determinate were the ultimate substance, the world would eventually be consumed by it. If fire is fundamental, fire would eventually win its battle against water and earth and air. If water is fundamental, all the fire would eventually be drowned. But the world we observe is not like this. The elements appear to be in a kind of dynamic balance, each checking the others, none permanently victorious, and this balance has presumably persisted for as long as the world has existed. The only way to explain this balance is to ground all the determinate elements in something that is not itself any one of them, something that can generate them all without favoring any of them. Something that has no stake in the outcome of their conflicts because it underlies all of them equally. The APEIRON in Anaximander's account is eternal and in constant motion, and from this eternal motion, the determinate things that make up the world are separated off or emerge through some process of differentiation that Anaximander describes, but that we can only partially reconstruct. The hot and the cold, the wet and the dry, separate out from the APEIRON and enter into the conflict with each other that generates the world as we know it. The APEIRON itself is not affected by this conflict, does not participate in it, and does not run out. It is the inexhaustible source from which all things come and to which all things return, a cosmic background against which the drama of natural existence plays out without ever exhausting or depleting the underlying ground. One of the most remarkable features of the APEIRON is that it is divine. He uses the word theos, the Greek word for God, to describe it, though what he means by this is nothing like the anthropomorphic divinities of Greek religion. The APEIRON is divine not because it is a person with plans and preferences, but because it has the two properties that Greeks most strongly associated with divinity, immortality and omnipotence, in the specific sense of being not subject to any external force or limitation. The gods of Greek religion were immortal and powerful, and so is the APEIRON. But the APEIRON's divinity is impersonal, structural, and logical, rather than personal, historical, and narrative. It is the ground of existence, rather than an actor in the story.
This move to place at the foundation of reality something that is in principle unlimited and indefinite, rather than something specific and observable, had consequences that rambled through the entire subsequent history of philosophy like tremors from a distant earthquake. Plato's world of forms, the timeless, perfect patterns that underlie the imperfect copies of everyday experience, owes something to Anaximander's APEIRON, though Plato would never have acknowledged the debt, and the similarities should not be overstated. Aristotle's concept of prime matter, the ultimate unformed substrate that underlies all material things without itself having any specific form, is directly influenced by Anaximander's thinking, and Aristotle discusses it explicitly in those terms. Even the Stoic concept of the pneuma, the divine rational fire that pervades and organizes all of reality, carries traces of Anaximander's conviction that the ultimate stuff of the cosmos is something that transcends ordinary categories. In modern philosophy and physics, the echoes are more distant but still audible. When physicists speak of quantum fields as the fundamental stuff of reality, formless potentialities from which specific particles emerge under the right conditions, they are working with a conceptual structure that has something in common with Anaximander's APEIRON, even though the mathematics and the experimental context are entirely different. When philosophers argue that being itself, the sheer fact of existence, is prior to and more fundamental than any specific existing thing, they are making a move that Anaximander made first, in rougher and less technically developed form, more than 2,500 years ago. The APEIRON is not modern physics, and Anaximander did not anticipate quantum mechanics, but the philosophical instinct that led him to posit the unlimited as the ground of the limited is one of the deepest and most recurring insights in human intellectual history. The APEIRON also explains something important about Anaximander's cosmology that might otherwise seem puzzling. He held that there are not just one world, but an indefinite number of worlds, perhaps simultaneous, perhaps successive, all emerging from the APEIRON and all eventually returning to it. This is an extraordinary idea for someone working in the early 6th century before the Common Era, and it follows directly from the nature of the APEIRON itself. If the APEIRON is truly unlimited, then there is no reason why only one world should emerge from it. The APEIRON is not diminished by producing a world, so it can produce as many worlds as the logic of its own nature allows, and since it has no determinate character that would favor one outcome over another, there is no reason to think it has produced only one. The plurality of worlds is a logical consequence of taking seriously what unlimited actually means.
What is equally striking about the APEIRON is what it says about the nature of explanation itself. Anaximander is not satisfied with explanations that simply replace one mystery with another, that say the world exists because the gods made it, and then leave the existence of the gods unexplained. He wants an explanation that genuinely bottoms out, that reaches a level at which no further why question arises, or at which the answer to the why question is built into the very nature of the thing being explained. The APEIRON is eternal and self-sustaining by definition. Its boundlessness means it has no external limits that could cut it off or destroy it, so it requires no further explanation. This aspiration toward ultimate explanation, toward a stopping point where the regress of why questions finally terminates, is one of the defining features of philosophical and scientific thinking, and Anaximander identified it and pursued it with unusual clarity for someone working at such an early moment in the tradition. He did not solve the problem, of course. The APEIRON raises as many questions as it answers. How exactly does the indefinite give rise to the definite? What is the mechanism by which the hot and the cold and the wet and the dry separate out from something that is none of them? Why does anything specific emerge from the boundless, rather than the boundless simply remaining what it is? Anaximander did not have answers to these questions that would satisfy a modern philosopher, and some of his successors, particularly Anaximenes, who proposed air rather than the APEIRON as the fundamental stuff, seem to have found his answer too abstract and retreated to something more manageable. But the fact that Anaximander raised the questions and formulated the problem with sufficient precision that subsequent thinkers could argue about it is itself a philosophical achievement of the first order. He identified what kind of thing the most fundamental explanation of reality needed to be, even if he could not fully deliver that explanation himself. Once Anaximander had established his account of the fundamental stuff of reality, he faced the second great challenge of ancient cosmology, explaining how the specific universe we actually observed, with its earth and sky, its sun and moon and stars, its predictable seasons and its dramatic weather, came to be and continues to work. His answers to these questions were, in many respects, as revolutionary as his account of the APEIRON, and several of them were right, or at least pointed in the right direction, in ways that would not be confirmed for many centuries after his death. Understanding how he built his universe out of pure reason, with no instruments beyond the naked eye and no mathematical tools beyond basic geometry, is one of the most instructive exercises in the history of scientific thought. The Earth in Anaximander's cosmology is a cylinder, roughly shaped like a drum or a short column, with a flat top surface and a height approximately 1/3 of its diameter. This is a strange shape to assign to the Earth, and it differs from both the flat disk that many earlier thinkers had assumed and the sphere that later Greek astronomers would correctly identify. But the cylindrical shape was not arbitrary. It seems to have been motivated by observational and geometrical considerations, the way the horizon looks similar from all directions, the way the sky appears to arch uniformly overhead, and perhaps the way eclipses suggested a circular boundary to the Earth's shadow. Anaximander was working from observation and trying to fit a geometrical shape to what he actually saw, which is a genuinely scientific approach, even if the specific answer was wrong. Far more remarkable than the shape of the Earth is Anaximander's account of its position in the cosmos. He held that the Earth stays where it is not because it is supported by anything underneath it, not by water, as Thales had suggested, not by pillars or by the back of a giant creature, as mythological traditions had imagined, but because it is equally distant from everything around it, and therefore has no reason to move in any particular direction. This is a principle of symmetry applied to cosmology, an argument that the uniformity of the Earth's situation in space, equidistant from all surrounding things, means that any reason that might cause it to fall in one direction is exactly balanced by an equal and opposite reason that would cause it to fall in the opposite direction, and the cancellation of these forces leaves it stationary in the center.
This argument has been praised by Aristotle and by modern historians of philosophy as one of the earliest examples of what we would now call the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that something will happen or be the case only if there is a sufficient reason for it to happen or be the case that way rather than some other way. The Earth does not move because there is no sufficient reason for it to move in any particular direction rather than any other. The argument is not correct in its physics. The actual reason the Earth does not fall is quite different, but it is philosophically sophisticated in a way that exceeds almost anything else being produced anywhere in the world at the time Anaximander was working. He was applying abstract logical principle to a concrete cosmological question in a way that constituted a genuine methodological advance. The sun, moon, and stars in Anaximander's cosmology are not the shining divine bodies of traditional Greek religion. They are not gods sailing across the sky in chariots, and they are not holes in a crystalline dome through which divine fire shines. They are, in his account, rings of fire surrounded and concealed by mist or darkness, with gaps or openings through which the fire is visible. The sun is an enormous ring, its diameter much larger than the Earth, with a single hole through which we see the fire within. The moon is a similar ring, smaller than the sun, with a hole that changes its apparent size over the course of the lunar cycle, explaining the phases of the moon as the hole opening and closing. The stars are the innermost rings, closest to the Earth, smaller and cooler than the sun or moon, but constructed on the same basic principle. This model is wrong in almost every particular, but the wrongness is philosophically instructive.
Anaximander was doing something that most of his contemporaries were not doing. He was trying to give a mechanical, non-mythological explanation for the specific, regular behavior of the celestial bodies, an explanation in terms of physical structures obeying physical laws, rather than in terms of divine will. The rings of fire are strange, but they are strange in the same way that a scientific hypothesis is sometimes strange, because reality is strange, and because the first attempts to explain strange things using unfamiliar categories often produce results that look bizarre from the outside, but embody a genuine methodological commitment to natural explanation. Anaximander was not trying to explain the sun in terms of what it felt like or what it meant, but in terms of what kind of physical thing it could actually be.
His meteorological explanations followed the same pattern, determinedly mechanical and rigorously non-divine. Wind, in his account, arises when fine vapors are evaporated from the earth by solar heat and gather until the air is dense enough to move. Thunder is produced when wind is enclosed in a thick cloud and bursts through it suddenly. Lightning occurs when the wind, bursting out, splits and ignites the compressed air around it. Rain falls when the sun's heat lifts moisture from the earth and it eventually cools and condenses back down. These explanations are wrong in their details, and they lack the mathematical precision that later meteorology would develop. But they represent the first systematic attempt to explain weather as a natural physical process rather than as a divine intervention, which is a philosophical achievement of enormous importance regardless of the scientific adequacy of the specific proposals. The size and distance of the heavenly bodies in Anaximander's cosmology are given in terms of specific numbers expressed as multiples of the Earth's diameter, with the Sun's ring at 27 or 28 Earth diameters, the Moon's ring at 18 or 19, and the stars at 9. These numbers are obviously not correct. The actual distances involved are incomparably greater. But the philosophical significance of the attempt to give precise quantitative values to cosmic distances is extraordinary. Anaximander was implicitly claiming that the cosmos has a mathematical structure, that the distances between things are not arbitrary but follow a pattern that can be expressed numerically, and that the job of the cosmologist is to find that pattern and state it precisely. This conviction that nature is mathematically ordered and that science consists in discovering that order is one of the most foundational commitments of the entire subsequent scientific tradition. One of the most striking features of Anaximander's cosmological thinking is his approach to the origin of the cosmos itself. Rather than positing a divine act of creation at the beginning of time, he described a process of natural differentiation in which the APEIRON generates something eternally, and the hot and cold separate out to form a great sphere of flame surrounding a dark, moist center. The sphere breaks up, with portions of fire being enclosed in rings of mist, and the central moisture dries out to form the earth we now stand on. This is not a creation story in any traditional sense. There is no creator, no divine decision, no moment of design. There is only a natural process that follows from the inherent properties of the APEIRON and the elements that emerge from it. The cosmos is, in this account, not made but generated, not designed but produced by the same kind of natural necessity that governs all the processes within it.
The implications of this for religious thought were radical, even if Anaximander himself did not draw them explicitly. If the cosmos was not created by a personal God, then it does not owe its character to divine choice, and its features cannot be explained by reference to divine intentions. The earth is round on top, not because God chose that shape, but because it is the shape that follows from the natural dynamics of the cosmic process. The sun follows its path across the sky not because God arranged it that way, but because the mechanics of the fire rings produce that result necessarily. Explanation in terms of natural necessity rather than divine choice is the fundamental methodological commitment of both philosophy and science. And Anaximander made it with unusual clarity and consistency for someone working at the very dawn of the philosophical tradition.
His cosmology also implicitly contained a profound time scale that had no precedent in the mythological thinking of his world. The APEIRON is eternal, without beginning or end, and the worlds that emerge from it follow each other in succession through vast stretches of time. The earth we live on is not the first world and will not be the last. It is one episode in a cosmic history that has no beginning and no end, a local eddy in the infinite and eternal process of the APEIRON, expressing itself in temporary, determinate forms. This picture of a universe operating on timescales vastly greater than human history, on scales that human imagination can barely grasp, is one that modern astronomy has confirmed in extraordinary detail, even though the specific mechanisms are entirely different. Anaximander arrived at the vast timescale of the cosmos not through observation, but through logic, through taking seriously what the eternality of the APEIRON implied about the history of the world.
Among all the ideas attributed to Anaximander, perhaps the most startling to a modern reader is his account of the origin of life and the origin of human beings, because what he proposed, fragmentary and incomplete as our knowledge of it is, bears remarkable resemblance to concepts that would not be developed in anything like a rigorous scientific form until Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in the 19th century. Anaximander did not have Darwin's evidence and did not have Darwin's mechanism, and the comparison can be pushed too far, but the basic intuition that living things developed from earlier, simpler forms through a process of natural transformation rather than through divine creation is present in Anaximander's thinking in a form that was genuinely unprecedented in the intellectual tradition he was part of. The starting point of Anaximander's biology is his account of the origin of life from moisture and warmth. He held that the first living things arose in the wet and muddy areas of the earth, generated by the action of solar heat on moisture, and that these first creatures were enclosed in prickly or thorny husks or barks, presumably for protection against the harsh conditions of a world not yet shaped to support complex life. This is not random speculation, but a reasoned inference from observation, since Anaximander and his contemporaries would have observed the spontaneous generation of small organisms in mud and stagnant water, a phenomenon that was universally believed in throughout the ancient world, and that seemed to provide empirical support for the idea that life could arise from non-living matter under the right conditions. What is genuinely remarkable is what Anaximander proposed next. He held that as the earth dried out over time, the first aquatic creatures were driven onto land and had to adapt to their new terrestrial environment. The transition from sea to land required the organisms to change, to develop new features appropriate to the new conditions they faced, and Anaximander seems to have thought of this as a natural process driven by necessity rather than a divine transformation. The creatures that successfully made the transition survived, and those that did not perished, which is at least a distant ancestor of the idea of differential survival that lies at the heart of Darwin's natural selection, though without any mechanism for inheritance or the accumulation of adaptive changes over generations.
The most extraordinary specific claim in Anaximander's account of biological origins is his proposal concerning human beings. He argued that humans could not have originated as they are now, because human infants are uniquely helpless compared to the young of other animals, and cannot survive without extended parental care from the moment of birth. If the first humans had been born as human infants, they would have died before they could grow up and reproduce, and the human species would never have gotten started. This means, Anaximander concluded, that humans must have originated in a different form, one capable of surviving independently from the beginning. He proposed that the first humans were born inside fish or fish-like creatures, were nurtured there until they were capable of independent survival, and then emerged onto land as fully formed or nearly fully formed human beings. This argument is biological reasoning of a kind that has no real parallel in earlier Greek thought. It starts from an observation about the helplessness of human infants, draws from this a logical conclusion about what the earliest humans must have been like, and uses that conclusion to motivate a specific account of human origins that explains the observable facts without appealing to divine creation or miraculous intervention.
The specific account is wildly wrong, of course, and it bears no resemblance to what we now know about human evolution. But the form of the reasoning, inferring the conditions of origin from the observed properties of the organism, is exactly the kind of reasoning that biological science uses. Anaximander was doing biology, not mythology, and the distinction matters even if the specific conclusions are not correct. The broader philosophical significance of Anaximander's biological thinking is its contribution to what we might call the naturalistic approach to human origins. Before Anaximander, and in most of the world's intellectual traditions even long after him, the question of where human beings came from was answered by reference to divine action. Gods created humans, shaped them from clay, breathed life into them, or placed them in the world as part of a divine plan. Anaximander's account removes the divine entirely from the explanation of human origins and replaces it with natural processes, the warmth on moisture, the drying out of the earth, the necessity of adaptation, the differential survival of forms capable of independent existence. This is a philosophical move of enormous importance, because once you have explained human origins naturally, you have implicitly committed yourself to the view that human beings are part of nature rather than separate from it, subject to the same kinds of explanations as other natural phenomena.
The connection between Anaximander's biological thinking and his cosmological thinking is tight and revealing. In both domains, he is looking for explanations in terms of natural necessity rather than divine choice. In both domains, he is willing to posit processes that operate over vast timescales rather than happening instantaneously at a divine command. And in both domains, he is committed to the view that the observed features of things can be explained by reference to their histories and to the conditions under which they arose. This is a unified methodological approach, not a collection of independent guesses about different topics, and it reflects a deep philosophical conviction about what explanation means and what kind of story about the world counts as a genuine account rather than a mere description or a mythological narrative. Ancient sources record that Anaximander was the first to use the term arche to mean the fundamental principle of things, a terminological innovation that had significant philosophical consequences because it distinguished between what everything is ultimately made of and the question of how things begin in time. The arche is not the first thing in a temporal sequence, but the underlying substance or principle in terms of which everything else can be explained. This distinction between temporal priority and explanatory priority is philosophically subtle and marks a significant advance in the precision with which Greek thinkers could formulate their questions about nature. The arche is the answer to what is always true about reality, not just what happened first. His account of the plurality of worlds, which we mentioned in connection with the APEIRON, also has implications for biology that Anaximander himself may or may not have drawn explicitly. If there are indefinitely many worlds, and if life arises naturally from the action of warmth on moisture wherever the right conditions obtain, then life presumably arises on many worlds, not just this one. This is a conclusion that follows from the combination of the APEIRON theory and the biological theory. And while we have no direct evidence that Anaximander himself drew it, the logic is compelling, and the conclusion is one that modern astronomers are now actively investigating. The search for life on other planets and moons is, in a deep sense, a scientific investigation of a question that Anaximander's philosophy raised first.
What is perhaps most moving about Anaximander's biological thinking is the seriousness with which he took the fragility and contingency of living things. Life, in his account, does not arise because God wills it, or because it is written into the nature of things from the beginning. It arises because specific physical conditions happen to be present, and if those conditions had been different, life would have been different, or might not have arisen at all. Living things survive because they happen to have properties that allow them to cope with their conditions, and they perish when those conditions change in ways they cannot handle. There is nothing guaranteed about life, nothing inevitable about the specific forms it takes, nothing that ensures that any particular species or any particular individual will survive. This is a sobering vision, but it is also a liberating one. because it means that what we are is the result of real processes rather than arbitrary divine decree, and understanding those processes is something we can actually aspire to do. The influence of Anaximander's biological thinking on subsequent ancient thinkers is difficult to trace precisely, partly because so much of the evidence has been lost, and partly because later thinkers often absorbed ideas without acknowledging their sources. But it is clear that the question he raised about the origin of living things and the naturalistic framework he proposed for answering it remained active in Greek intellectual life for centuries after his death. Empedocles proposed his own theory of the natural origin of life and the survival of organisms suited to their conditions, echoing themes from Anaximander. Aristotle developed an elaborate and sophisticated biology that, whatever its differences from Anaximander's approach, shared the fundamental commitment to explaining living things in terms of natural causes rather than divine ones. And through Aristotle, the naturalistic approach to biology became part of the inheritance that the Western scientific tradition eventually drew on when it began to develop evolutionary theory in earnest.
We come now to the single most important piece of primary evidence we have for Anaximander, the one sentence that has survived from his original writing, preserved for us by the 6th century philosopher Simplicius in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics. This sentence, which Simplicius quotes as coming directly from Anaximander's own text, is just over 30 words in Greek, and it is simultaneously the oldest surviving passage of Western prose philosophy and one of the most discussed, disputed, and philosophically rich sentences in the entire history of human thought. Reading it carefully, thinking through what it actually says and what it implies, takes us closer to Anaximander's own thinking than anything else we have, and the experience of doing so, of trying to see through this tiny window into a mind that was working more than 2,500 years ago, is one of the most remarkable intellectual adventures available to a student of philosophy. The sentence, in one standard English translation, reads something like this: "The things that are perish into the things out of which they come to be, according to necessity, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice, in accordance with the ordering of time." Every word in this sentence repays careful attention. The things that are, meaning everything that exists in the ordinary sense, everything that has determinate qualities and specific forms, perish into the things out of which they come to be, meaning they return to the source from which they originally emerged, which is the APEIRON. This return is according to necessity. It is not accidental or contingent, but follows from the fundamental nature of things. And the reason things must return to their source is because they pay penalty and retribution for their injustice. The language of penalty, retribution, and injustice in a sentence that is ostensibly about cosmology and the nature of existence is what makes this fragment so philosophically extraordinary and so endlessly debated. What injustice could a physical object possibly commit? How can the hot and the cold wrong each other? What crime does the summer commit against the winter that it must eventually make restitution for? The most straightforward reading is that Anaximander is using legal and moral vocabulary as a metaphor for a natural process, the way that determinate things in nature always eventually overstep their natural boundaries and have to be corrected back into proportion. The summer heat oversteps, and winter is its punishment. The river floods its banks, and the drought that follows is the restitution. But the metaphor is not arbitrary or decorative. It reflects a deep philosophical conviction that the natural order and the moral order share a structure, that the concept of justice, meaning balance, proportion, not exceeding your appropriate share, applies to both human affairs and natural processes, because both are governed by the same underlying necessity.
The APEIRON establishes a kind of cosmic norm, a state of balance in which no single element dominates permanently, and everything that exists departs from this norm when it takes on its specific determinate form, and eventually pays the price for that departure by being reabsorbed into the boundless from which it came. Justice in Anaximander's cosmos is not a human invention imposed on a neutral nature, but a feature of reality itself that human justice imperfectly reflects. This idea has enormous philosophical consequences that ripple through the subsequent tradition. If justice is a feature of the cosmos rather than just a human convention, then human beings who live unjustly are not just violating social norms, but are going against the grain of reality itself. If the universe moves toward balance and proportion and the correction of excess, then a life lived in excess, in the greedy accumulation of power or wealth or pleasure at the expense of others, is a life that is working against the deepest tendencies of the world it inhabits. This is a moral vision grounded in cosmology rather than in divine command or social contract, and it is one of the earliest and most powerful attempts in Western thought to give ethics an objective, non-arbitrary foundation. The influence of Anaximander on the subsequent history of Greek philosophy is both direct and diffuse. His most immediate successor was Anaximenes of Miletus, who proposed air rather than the APEIRON as the fundamental stuff, but who shared Anaximander's commitment to natural explanation and his framework of fundamental substance underlying all things. Heraclitus of Ephesus, working a generation or two after Anaximander, developed a cosmology in which fire plays the role of the fundamental active principle, and in which the tension and conflict between opposites is the driving force of all change, echoing themes from Anaximander while developing them in a distinctive and highly original direction. The Atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, who proposed that all things are made of tiny, indivisible particles moving through void, were in a broad sense continuing the project that Anaximander began, of explaining all observable phenomena in terms of fundamental entities governed by natural necessity.
Aristotle, who is our most important ancient source for pre-Socratic philosophy, engaged with Anaximander extensively and critically, both in his Physics, where he discusses Anaximander's account of the fundamental principle, and in his other works where he treats Anaximander's cosmological and biological ideas. Aristotle rejected the APEIRON as a viable account of the fundamental substance, preferring a theory in which the basic material of things has more specific properties, but he recognized Anaximander's move as philosophically serious and engaged with it as such rather than dismissing it. The very fact that Aristotle devoted significant attention to Anaximander is a testimony to the enduring philosophical seriousness of his proposals. The Stoics, who dominated Greek philosophy from the 3rd century before the Common Era through the 1st centuries of the Common Era, developed a cosmology in which a divine rational fire, the pneuma or logos, pervades all of reality and governs it according to rational necessity. This picture has obvious structural similarities to Anaximander's, with the active governing principle playing a role analogous to the APEIRON, and the specific temporary forms of ordinary existence playing a role analogous to the modes that emerge from and return to the APEIRON. The Stoic commitment to the idea that the universe is governed by a rational natural necessity, accessible to human reason, and expressing itself in the regularity of natural law, is a philosophical descendant of Anaximander's foundational conviction, even if the Stoics developed it in their own distinctive direction. Beyond the ancient world, Anaximander's ideas have continued to find echoes and resonances in philosophical and scientific thinking that testify to the depth of the problems he identified and the fertility of the approaches he pioneered. The idea that reality has a more fundamental level than the observable world of specific things, that the ultimate ground of existence is something that transcends the categories we normally use to describe experience, recurs in many of the most important philosophical systems of the modern period.
Kant's thing in itself, the reality that underlies and grounds the phenomena we can actually experience, is not the APEIRON, but it performs a philosophically similar function, marking the limit of what human cognition can grasp, while insisting that there is something beyond that limit which is the condition of possibility for everything we can grasp.
The discovery of cosmic evolution in modern astronomy, the understanding that the universe has a history, that it began in an extraordinary event of concentrated energy and matter, and has been expanding and differentiating ever since, producing stars and planets and galaxies, and eventually life over billions of years, is in some ways the scientific realization of the vision Anaximander was reaching for. He could not have known about the Big Bang, or about stellar nucleosynthesis, or about the geological and biological history of the Earth, but he was reaching for exactly the kind of picture that modern cosmology has produced, a universe that has a history, that generates its specific forms over vast stretches of time from a more primordial state, and that operates according to natural necessity rather than divine whim. The specific details are entirely different, but the philosophical structure is recognizably the same. What Anaximander ultimately represents is not just a set of specific philosophical positions, but a fundamental orientation toward the world, an orientation that became the defining characteristic of both philosophy and science in the Western tradition. He represents the conviction that the world is intelligible, that the human mind can understand how things work and why they are as they are, that explanation in terms of natural necessity is both possible and preferable to explanation in terms of divine will or mythological narrative, that the questions worth asking are the hardest ones about the nature of existence itself rather than the comfortable ones that accept the inherited answers, and that intellectual honesty, the refusal to pretend you understand something you do not understand, or to accept an answer that does not actually answer the question, is not just a virtue, but a moral obligation for anyone who cares about truth.
Anaximander of Miletus lived over 2,600 years ago in a world without telescopes, without chemistry, without the accumulated knowledge of 2.5 millennia of scientific investigation. And yet the questions he asked and the answers he attempted are still alive and still powerful enough to teach us something essential about what it means to think seriously about the nature of reality. He gave us the idea that behind the apparent diversity and conflict of the observable world, there is a single, limitless ground from which all things emerge and to which all things return, an idea whose specific form in his writing we call the APEIRON, but whose philosophical energy has never stopped generating new versions of itself in the history of human thought. He gave us the idea that the Earth hangs freely in space without support, held in place by the symmetry of its situation, which was a step toward the modern understanding of gravity and planetary motion that required the combined genius of Copernicus and Newton to fully develop. He gave us the first systematic attempt to explain the origin of life and the origin of human beings through natural processes rather than divine creation, pointing toward a direction of inquiry that Darwin would eventually complete with devastating thoroughness. He gave us the conviction that justice is not just a human invention, but a feature of the cosmos itself, that balance and proportion are written into the structure of reality, and that everything that exceeds its proper measure will eventually be corrected. And he gave us that single surviving sentence, 30 words that carry within them an entire philosophical vision of the world, proof that the deepest things can sometimes be expressed in the fewest words, by someone who has actually thought them through to their foundations. If you found this journey through the mind of Anaximander as extraordinary as his ideas deserve, consider subscribing to Philosophy and History of Thought, where we bring you the thinkers whose ideas continue to shape the world we live in. Leave a comment below about which of Anaximander's ideas surprised you most, because the conversation that he started 2,500 years ago is one that is still worth having today.